The Hidden Illness of the Virgin Queen. Why Elizabeth Chose Loneliness Over Love. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time of stiff collars, fussy ruffs, and the slow, meticulous plotting of crowns and reputations. Settle in. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe stretch out just a little. We're about to wander through the quiet corridors of the Elizabethan court, where the Virgin Queen reigned, Elizabeth I, and perhaps where she quietly suffered in ways her courtiers never fully understood. Elizabeth wasn't just any queen. She was, naturally, a symbol, a living emblem of her nation's independence and her father's notorious lineage. But behind the embroidered gowns, the carefully applied rouge, and the pearly composure, was a woman who made deliberate choices about solitude. She chose, for reasons both political and personal, not to marry, not because of a scandalous lover or a rebellious streak. Often it was because her body and health whispered to her, subtly but persistently, that love or even close companionship might be dangerous. It's tempting to imagine Elizabeth laughing at banquets, tossing clever retorts like breadcrumbs to her courtiers. And yes, she did enjoy such moments. But there was a hidden fragility to her, one that modern historians can only gently speculate upon. It seems that she suffered from what we would now call a chronic illness, a collection of symptoms, really, that made her vulnerable and cautious. Some suggested tuberculosis, though that seems unlikely. Others thought the fainting spells and constant fatigue might be anemia, or some rare form of autoimmune disorder. Whatever it was, it dictated much of her behavior, and perhaps, more than anything else, it shaped her lifelong romance with loneliness. Elizabeth's childhood was, in many ways, the training ground for her later caution. Born in 1533 to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, she entered a court already simmering with tension. Her mother would, famously, be executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. Imagine the quiet terror of those early years, the whispers of treason, and the ever-present awareness that a single misstep could lead to your head being removed. She watched siblings rise and fall, and she learned early that security and survival often required distance. Distance from affection, distance from passion, distance from anyone who could exploit weakness. Her education was rigorous to the point of exhaustion. Latin, Greek, history, philosophy, music, embroidery, dancing, horse riding, she mastered them all, because failure was unthinkable. And while Elizabeth did enjoy certain tutors and confidants, her heart was trained in subtle self-protection. By the time she ascended to the throne in 1558, she was, naturally, brilliant, unshakable in public, and yet quietly fragile. Courtiers and foreign ambassadors often assumed that Elizabeth's reluctance to marry was purely political. After all, a queen needed alliances, a male consort, heirs. But the truth is, Elizabeth was acutely aware of her body's limitations. She may have noticed early on that intimate encounters could leave her faint, feverish, or prone to lingering illness. And the stakes were high. In an era before modern medicine, complications from even minor infections could be fatal. It was prudent, in a grim sort of way, to avoid romantic entanglements. Still, suitors came, and she entertained them, often toying with their hopes as a sort of subtle amusement. Philip II of Spain, the Duke of Anjou, Robert Dudley. She knew the importance of these matches, yet she would listen, smile, and decline, always with careful words. Some historians suggest she relished the drama of courtly romance as much as she feared its risks. One can almost picture her in her private chambers, quietly chuckling at the desperation of men who would never know her fully, while she nursed a slight headache or perhaps a dull ache in her chest. Her wardrobe, famously elaborate, may have served more than just ceremonial function. Those enormous gowns, heavy ruffs, and layers of silk and velvet could conceal frailty. A fainting spell, a sudden weakness, none of it would be visible to a crowd of hundreds. And Elizabeth, ever conscious of image, protected herself meticulously. The Virgin Queen, as the world knew her, was a carefully curated persona, designed to inspire awe and avoid vulnerability. We should also consider the psychological dimensions. Growing up amid executions, betrayals, and shifting alliances teaches subtle lessons about the fragility of the human body and mind. Elizabeth was not merely cautious, she was calculating. Loneliness, in her case, became a shield. It was not an absence of desire, but a form of survival. And while history remembers her for sharp political acumen, it also quietly preserves the echo of pain, the faint tremor behind a perfectly measured smile. Perhaps one of the most telling aspects of her life was her relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Dudley was a lifelong companion, loyal in ways few could match. Their bond, intimate in its closeness, never culminated in marriage, partly political, partly personal. And maybe, partly because Elizabeth, ever so wisely, understood her own limits. Her health may have whispered in soft and unrelenting tones that some risks were not worth taking. Dudley, for all his charm and devotion, could never bridge the gap between desire and self-preservation. Elizabeth's diet, surprisingly restrictive, also points to her underlying fragility. Courtly feasts were abundant, lavish, and often greasy. She herself was careful, often avoiding overindulgence. One wonders whether this was a matter of vanity or whether she had learned through repeated bouts of illness that moderation was essential. Perhaps she nursed a mild anemia with careful selection of meats, fruits, and herbs. Perhaps she avoided excess because excess could bring danger. In a court filled with spies, plots, and inevitable illness, prudence was a form of rebellion. And so, the Virgin Queen navigated a court of intrigue with grace, intellect, and caution. Her advisors, foreign diplomats, and even her own family often misread her intentions. She flirted without attachment, allowed gestures of devotion without surrender, and maintained an aura of untouchable authority. And behind this persona, quietly, she managed chronic illness with the dignity and subtle cunning of someone who knew the body's limits better than any courtier. Her reign was long, 45 years in total. That longevity, particularly in a period rife with disease and conflict, speaks to her remarkable attention to self-preservation. She survived smallpox, influenza, and the many perils of political life. One might argue that her greatest triumph wasn't the defeat of the Spanish Armada or the patronage of Shakespeare and Marlowe, but her ability to navigate a lifetime of personal fragility without public collapse. And perhaps, in her quiet, private moments, she reflected on the irony that the world revered her strength while she herself carefully managed weakness. As we drift through the layers of her life, it becomes apparent that Elizabeth's virginity was less a political stunt and more a gentle, unspoken negotiation with her own body. Love, passion, and physical intimacy carried risks that she was unwilling to bear. And so the Virgin Queen chose solitude, adorned in pearls and velvet, ruling not only through strategy and intelligence, but also through a subtle, understated art of survival. The crown was heavy, certainly, but her wisdom, often unspoken, was heavier still. And now, let's drift over to the next royal fiasco, where health, ambition, and unfortunate circumstance collide in quieter, yet equally intriguing ways. We'll move from England to the sunlit, sometimes perilous courts of France, and meet another figure
whose life was quietly governed by fragility, indulgence, and the subtle whims of fate.
The fragile King of France, Charles IX, and the silent weight of royal suffering. So let's glide from Elizabeth's careful solitude across the English Channel to the gilded, scented, and often treacherous corridors of the French court. Here we find Charles IX, a boy king with more crowns than sense, and a life quietly haunted by ill health, anxiety, and the subtle terror of constant expectation. Charles was born in 1550 to Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. Catherine, of course, was the consummate stage mother of her era, ambitious, politically astute, and profoundly wary of anyone who might outshine her children. Charles was the second son, which already complicated matters. As is often the case in royal households, being second meant living in the shadow of older siblings, while simultaneously being expected to excel in ways that could never truly satisfy. Charles's health was always fragile. He was small, delicate, and prone to a series of persistent illnesses that left him weak and often pale. His body seemed determined, almost stubbornly, to remind the world that he was mortal, a trait not widely appreciated in a society obsessed with divine right and royal invincibility. The young king spent much of his childhood under careful medical supervision, with physicians who were more likely to bleed him than to cure him, yet whose constant attention nonetheless offered some sense of security. The court, as always, was a theater of tension and expectation. Charles was expected to be strong, decisive, and masculine, while simultaneously suffering from an anxiety that made even routine social interactions exhausting. He was surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and siblings, all watching for weakness, ready to exploit a misstep, and naturally he felt every ounce of it. Some historians suggest that he may have suffered from what we would now call generalized anxiety disorder, exacerbated by the very real threat of assassination, rebellion, and the relentless pressures of kingship. Charles's mother, Catherine, played a dual role, protector and manipulator. She understood her son's fragility and often stepped in to shield him from the worst of courtly cruelty. Yet she also used her weakness as a political instrument, subtly steering decisions while presenting them as Charles's own. There is a quiet, tragic irony here. A boy meant to embody the power of the French crown, yet so physically and emotionally delicate that his mother had to navigate much of the realm on his behalf. And then there were the Huguenots, the Protestant minority whose presence in France stirred unrest and whose suppression became a preoccupation of the French monarchy. Charles inherited a kingdom divided by faith, violence, and the silent tension of whispered plots. The young king, already prone to physical frailty, had to make decisions with consequences far beyond his years. One might imagine him seated on the throne, pale hands gripping gilded arms, trying to appear untroubled, while his stomach and chest reminded him of every meal that had disagreed with him, every restless night, every fainting spell. It was in this context that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurred in 1572, an event historians approach with quiet, cautious horror. Charles, only 22 at the time, was a pawn in a web of political scheming. Catherine's influence loomed large, and Charles, anxious and indecisive, reportedly suffered from extreme panic as the massacre unfolded. He was present, but perhaps not entirely in control. Some accounts suggest he fainted repeatedly during the chaos, a physical manifestation of both fear and the chronic frailty that had defined his life. The massacre itself, of course, has been studied extensively, but here we are more interested in the subtle interplay of illness, anxiety, and royal expectation. Charles's delicate constitution made it almost impossible for him to assert full control, yet expectation demanded decisiveness. One can almost feel the weight of the crown pressing down, not just on his head, but on his chest, tightening with each whispered counsel from ministers, each pleading glance from his mother, each demand from factions vying for influence. Charles's personal habits reflected his need for careful management of his energy and health. He was not particularly indulgent, though he enjoyed hunting and the occasional elaborate feast, mostly as duty rather than pleasure. Sleep was a constant concern, as nights of restlessness could lead to spells of weakness. Courtiers whispered about his pale complexion and frequent fainting, which only increased his anxiety. A quiet, cyclical torment that rarely made its way into official chronicles. Romance, too, was a tricky affair. He was married to Elizabeth of Austria, a union arranged for political gain rather than affection. The young king's emotional life was cautious, understated, and constrained by both temperament and circumstance. Love, like so much else, was filtered through layers of fear, expectation, and illness. He did not, as some kings did, pursue passion with reckless abandon. He simply endured it, as one might endure a complicated meal or a difficult conversation with a fussy noble. Interestingly, Charles's fragility extended beyond the physical and emotional. He seemed to internalize responsibility to an almost unbearable degree. When violence erupted in the kingdom, he interpreted it as a reflection of his own inadequacy. He worried incessantly about offending God, angering his advisors, and failing to live up to the ideal of kingship. In a world that demanded outward strength, he was quietly consumed by inward weakness. And so the young king drifted through life as a man surrounded by grandeur, yet always aware of the precariousness of his own existence. Charles IX's reign was not long. He died at the age of 23, after years of chronic illness that worsened in the wake of stress and anxiety. Some contemporaries attributed his death to tuberculosis, others to epilepsy or a sudden infection. Whatever the cause, it is clear that his fragile constitution played a significant role in the manner and timing of his demise. He had lived under immense pressure, never fully recovering from the physical and emotional strain imposed by the crown and the court. As we reflect on Charles's life, it is important to note the quiet tragedy that often accompanies historical greatness. Here was a king whose reign was defined not by bold conquest or daring innovation, but by the careful, exhausting management of personal weakness. The court saw a monarch, pale but regal, decisive but constrained, and largely misunderstood. And Charles, in turn, navigated his existence with a mixture of obedience, anxiety, and a touch of ironic detachment. A young man aware that the world demanded he be something he could rarely fully embody. It is easy in the modern mind to romanticize kings and queens as larger-than-life figures, immune to illness and doubt. But Charles IX reminds us that fragility can exist even at the highest levels of power. He was a man whose body betrayed him, whose mind was ever alert to danger, and whose life was a careful balancing act between duty and self-preservation. And perhaps, if we imagine him quietly, seated in a dimly lit chamber at night, maybe staring at a candle's flicker, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, knowing that the decisions of the day had been exhausting in every sense, we can sense the same sort of private melancholy that Elizabeth knew so well. The kind that comes not from a dramatic loss, but from the persistent, unremarkable demands of survival. Charles's story, like a gentle sigh through the halls of the Louvre, reminds us that monarchy is not always about pomp, pageantry, or decisive victories. Sometimes it is about endurance, about negotiating with one's own limitations, and about quietly managing anxiety while the world watches, largely unaware. He was a king who survived in small, understated ways, until, inevitably, his body
could survive no longer. And so, as we drift from England's cautious virgin queen to France's delicate boy king, we notice a pattern emerging. These figures, elevated to the very pinnacle of power, were often quietly undermined by the fragility of their own bodies and minds. Their lives were shaped not only by politics and ambition, but by the subtle, persistent limitations imposed by illness, anxiety, and circumstance. It's a humbling reminder that history's grandeur often coexists with personal struggles, struggles that remain invisible to the casual observer, yet profoundly shape events in ways both small and monumental. Let's allow ourselves for a moment to imagine the quiet moments that history often overlooks. Charles IX, alone in his chambers at night, perhaps staring at a candle's flicker, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, knowing that the decisions of the day had been exhausting in every sense. Elizabeth I, similarly in the dimmed glow of her own private rooms, aware of the limits her body imposed, yet maintaining an outward composure that dazzled nations. These glimpses remind us that royalty is often as human as it is ceremonious, and that the very act of surviving the day can in itself be a remarkable feat. And now, as we prepared to drift further into the labyrinth of European dynastic oddities, we'll move on to a slightly more dramatic, yet equally quietly tragic tale, that of the Spanish Habsburgs, whose obsession with inbreeding and fragile health would produce some of history's most peculiar and at times sorrowful figures. Because if there is one thing history shows us, it's that the combination of fragile bodies and immense power tends to create quietly compelling, endlessly fascinating stories. Stories that, while perhaps not heroic in the traditional sense, are deeply human and perfectly suited to a calm, reflective evening of historical contemplation. As we glide from the fragile boy king of France, let's now move to Spain, where the Habsburgs held court with their customary grandeur and a peculiar preoccupation with family trees. Here we meet Charles II of Spain, a man whose very existence seems to have been shaped by a relentless devotion to inbreeding, and whose life offers a quiet, tragic illustration of what happens when dynastic ambition meets human frailty. Charles II was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. And yes, before you ask, he was Habsburg enough to make a genealogist weep. His parents were uncle and niece, which, as you can imagine, is not exactly the recipe for robust health. In fact, Charles's appearance and constitution quickly revealed the consequences of generations of careful and perhaps obsessive consanguinity. From birth, Charles was delicate, prone to illness, and oddly shaped. His jaw was so pronounced and misshapen that it gave him difficulty eating,
and he was nicknamed by some contemporaries the Bewitched, a rather polite euphemism for a child who struggled to survive against almost impossible odds. He had weak muscles, poor coordination, and suffered a series of chronic infections. One imagines that even lifting a cup of water was, at times, a minor heroic act. The court around him, naturally, oscillated between fascination and horror. To be fair, they tried. Doctors, wet nurses, tutors, and advisors devoted themselves to keeping Charles alive, often with treatments that were more likely to harm than heal. Bloodletting was routine, as were concoctions of herbs, and occasionally gold dust, which was thought to purify the body. One wonders if Charles's discomfort was increased by the gentle insistence of physicians who, while well-meaning, often did more harm than good. His childhood was long and cautious. Unlike the dashing or even precociously intelligent young monarchs we've met, Charles seemed to grow in fits and starts, each development delayed by weakness or illness. He could not walk or sit properly until later than most children. He had trouble speaking clearly. He was constantly observed, constantly managed, and perhaps constantly aware of his own limitations. And yet he survived long enough to inherit the throne. A minor miracle, really, considering his fragile constitution and the unfortunate decisions of his forebearers. The Habsburg obsession with dynastic purity continued to influence his life, of course. Marriage and reproduction were always framed as matters of state, not affection. Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a woman chosen for her bloodline rather than compatibility. But for Charles, the pressures of marriage were compounded by his physical limitations. He was impotent, weak, and often ill, which made the production of heirs, a matter of life and death for the dynasty, a nearly impossible task. The Spanish throne hung in delicate balance, held in place by a man whose own body could barely bear the weight of existence. Charles's health dictated his political influence as well. Decisions were often delayed or delegated because he lacked the stamina to participate in extended councils or negotiations. Ministers and advisors effectively ruled the country in his stead, a quiet delegation that may have spared him additional strain, but left him vulnerable to manipulation. And yet his very presence on the throne served as a symbol, however fragile, of continuity and legitimacy, a living testament to the enduring, if somewhat disastrous, commitment of the Habsburgs to inbreeding. His appearance, as noted by contemporaries, reinforced his fragility. His jaw, a pronounced result of generations of Habsburg marriages, made eating difficult. His limbs were thin and weak. He was prone to sudden bouts of illness that could, without warning, incapacitate him for days or weeks. And yet he survived into adulthood, which is remarkable when one considers both his genetic inheritance and the often misguided medical practices of the 17th century. There is a quiet irony to Charles's reign. The Habsburgs had achieved unprecedented power and influence across Europe, yet the very measures taken to preserve their dynastic purity produced a monarch ill-equipped to exercise it. Charles, in his physical and mental frailty, became a living illustration of the limits of human endurance and the unintended consequences of ambition unchecked by biology. And through it all, he maintained a degree of dignity, surviving in a world that offered him few natural advantages. Charles's reign lasted from 1665 to 1700, and it was marked not by conquests or brilliant diplomacy, but a quiet endurance. He faced domestic strife, foreign pressure, and the constant need for succession planning. His advisors, more often than not, managed the day-to-day operations of governance. Charles's life was, in many ways, a long negotiation with weakness itself. Every action required consideration of his frailty. Every engagement demanded careful energy management. And all the while, he maintained the ceremonial grandeur expected of a Spanish king, even if it must have been exhausting. The end of Charles II's life was, unsurprisingly, a prolonged struggle. He suffered from repeated infections, digestive issues, and general debility. By the time of his death, he was scarcely recognizable as a man capable of ruling, though he had managed, with careful attention, to survive long enough to leave behind a lasting, if tragic, legacy. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, a dramatic but quietly inevitable consequence of generations of dynastic obsession. In reflecting on Charles II, we see a recurring theme in European royalty: immense responsibility paired with physical fragility. Here was a man whose life was dominated not by conquest or diplomacy, but by the quiet endurance of weakness. He reminds us that power, when divorced from human resilience, can become both fragile and tragic, and that sometimes the most compelling stories of monarchy are not those of triumph, but of survival under nearly impossible circumstances. There is something almost hypnotically melancholy about this. Charles, pale and frail, moving through grand halls that echoed with expectation, trying to perform duties beyond his strength. It is not a tale of villainy, nor of scandal, but of human limitation pressed against historical pressure. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity produced a king who, despite the weight of crowns and the grandeur of ceremonies, was quietly and continuously at the mercy of his own body. And so, as we continue our gentle exploration, we can start to appreciate a pattern. The very mechanisms designed to preserve power, careful marriages, dynastic strategies, elaborate court rituals, often amplified human vulnerability. Elizabeth I managed her health through solitude. Charles IX navigated anxiety and expectation. Charles II struggled with the consequences of inherited frailty. Each of these lives, remarkable in their own way, reminds us that royalty is often less about invincibility and more about endurance. And let's allow ourselves a quiet moment to picture Charles II in the soft glow of candlelight, seated with difficulty, perhaps trying to eat a meal that challenges him physically, while courtiers whisper advice, fearing for the stability of the nation. The scene is not dramatic in the conventional sense, but it is profoundly human, the combination of immense expectation, physical limitation, and quiet, dogged survival. And now, as we continue our gentle exploration, we will move to another corner of Europe, where the fragile and eccentric fates of royalty manifest in slightly more flamboyant, though no less tragic ways. We'll visit the courts of Austria and Italy and meet figures whose lives were shaped by the same careful management of health, image, and expectation. Because, as we've learned, history is rarely just about battles or conquests. Often it is about the quiet, almost imperceptible struggles that shape the decisions, behaviors, and even the legacies of
the Austrian Habsburgs, Maria Theresa, and the weight of dynastic duty. From the pale, fragile Spanish Habsburgs, we now shift our gaze to Austria, where the Habsburgs continued their long tradition of dynastic diligence, ceremonial grandeur, and quiet personal suffering. Here, we meet Maria Theresa, a woman whose life was defined by duty, ambition,
and an almost relentless sense of responsibility that often left little room for personal comfort or joy. Maria Theresa was born in 1717, the daughter of Emperor Charles VI and Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. She entered a world steeped in strict protocols, elaborate rituals, and a constant awareness that every decision, gesture, and marriage in the family affected not just herself, but the empire. As a child, she was educated with unusual rigor for a girl of her time. Languages, diplomacy, etiquette, history, and the management of estates and armies. Even playtime seemed to have the faint aroma of duty, as tutors hovered nearby, correcting posture or pronunciation, gently but firmly reminding her that her life would never truly be her own. From a young age, Maria Theresa displayed remarkable intelligence and diligence, but alongside this brilliance was a constant awareness of fragility, not physical fragility, as in some of the Habsburgs we've met, but a more psychological and social fragility. She understood that the weight of the empire rested upon her shoulders, and that the slightest misstep could have catastrophic consequences. She absorbed anxiety quietly, often turning it into meticulous planning and relentless attention to detail. Her father, Charles VI, had worked tirelessly to secure the pragmatic sanction, a legal mechanism that would allow Maria Theresa to inherit the Habsburg lands in her own right. It was an impressive feat of diplomacy, ensuring that in theory she could rule as a woman in a world dominated by men. In practice, however, it meant that from birth, Maria Theresa was both heir and hostage to expectation. Every letter she wrote, every bow she made, every diplomatic decision, even the selection of suitable husbands for her children, was scrutinized with meticulous care. When Charles VI died in 1440, Maria Theresa assumed the throne of the Habsburg dominions at the age of 23. One might imagine the pressures she faced, the empire teetering on the brink of war, rival nations questioning a woman's legitimacy, and advisors eager to guide, manipulate, or override her decisions. And yet she handled it with a remarkable blend of firmness and practicality, all the while managing the subtle personal costs of absolute responsibility. Her health, while generally robust, often reflected the immense pressures she carried. She suffered from frequent migraines, digestive disturbances, and insomnia, hardly surprising for someone tasked with the daily management of vast territories, armies, and a sprawling bureaucracy. Maria Theresa also endured personal grief quietly, losing children to illness and miscarriage, experiences that left her both sorrowful and resolutely practical. Her letters, when examined closely, reveal a woman capable of deep affection and anxiety, yet always returning to the necessities of governance. Marriage for Maria Theresa was less a matter of romance and more a matter of dynastic calculation. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a union designed to secure alliances and strengthen the empire. And while some historians speculate on the warmth of their personal relationship, it is clear that political duty always framed their intimacy. She bore 16 children, an astonishing number even by the standards of her era, though the process was physically taxing and emotionally draining. And yet she endured it, combining personal sacrifice with a keen eye for dynastic strategy. Maria Theresa's daily life was a delicate dance between public display and private management. She would rise early, receive petitions, review reports, and conduct audiences with an energy that belied her internal fatigue. Then, in the evenings, she would oversee her household, attend to the education of her children, and correspond with distant diplomats. Her life was an endless succession of duties, a careful orchestration of appearances, decisions, and attention. And through it all, she remained remarkably effective, navigating wars, treaties, and domestic challenges with a calm, methodical precision. Yet beneath the surface of competence lay a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Maria Theresa worried incessantly about succession, the health and education of her children, and the stability of her empire. She was aware of her own limitations, and she worked tirelessly to compensate for them with meticulous planning and relentless attention. It is tempting to imagine her, at night, seated by candlelight, reviewing letters and accounts, feeling the soft pressure of responsibility pressing down on her like a velvet-clad weight. Interestingly, Maria Theresa also displayed subtle traits of what we might now recognize as perfectionism. She expected extraordinary diligence from those around her, whether ministers, courtiers, or children. Mistakes were quietly noted, corrected, and rarely ignored. And yet she combined this rigor with deep personal devotion to her children, to her husband, and to the empire itself. There is a quietly sardonic humor in the thought that she could be both an exacting ruler and a devoted mother, a combination that left her exhausted but fundamentally effective. Her reign was long and stable, lasting from 1440 to 1780, and marked by careful reforms, military campaigns, and cultural patronage. Maria Theresa was not a flamboyant queen, nor one to indulge in excesses. She rarely courted scandal or dramatic displays. Instead, she exemplified a quiet, steady, and meticulous exercise of power. And in this steadiness, there is something soothing, almost hypnotic, a demonstration that endurance, careful planning, and attention to detail can, in themselves, be forms of extraordinary leadership. Let's picture her for a moment, seated in her private chambers in Vienna, the soft candlelight flickering across carefully arranged documents, the quiet hum of distant servants, the faint aroma of wax and parchment. She reviews reports, considers military strategies, thinks of her children, and perhaps allows herself a small sigh. Not a dramatic exhalation, not a public declaration, but a gentle acknowledgment of the weight she carries and the quiet fortitude she exercises each day. And now, as we prepare to drift to the next tale, we'll leave Maria Theresa's quiet corridors and enter the eccentric, sometimes indulgent courts of the later Bourbon monarchs of France. Here we will meet rulers whose opulence and whimsy masked subtle frailties, petty rivalries, and occasionally absurd personal habits, further illustrations of the human, often.
Now let's glide forward in time to France, a land still perfumed with powdered wigs, lavish feasts, and the subtle, inevitable decay of dynastic grandeur. Here we encounter Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, Louis XIV, whose own shadow still loomed over Versailles. Louis XV's reign, which began in 1715 when he was only 5 years old, offers a curious mix of youthful expectation, indulgent courtly whimsy, and the quiet vulnerabilities that accompany inherited power. Louis XV was not a fragile child in the sense of Charles IX or Charles II of Spain, yet he carried his own peculiar limitations. He inherited a kingdom shaped by opulence and ritual, where every gesture was noted and every misstep amplified. The young king grew up in a court suffused with ceremony, surrounded by advisors, governesses, and tutors who sought to mold him into the perfect embodiment of French majesty. And yet, as is often the case, human nature intervened quietly. Louis was charming, but not particularly studious, playful, but not always disciplined, and prone to the gentle indulgences of youth that would follow him into adulthood. By the time he assumed full power, Louis XV was a man of delicate habits and refined sensibilities. He disliked confrontation, preferred the comfort of Versailles to the rougher business of politics, and developed a taste for personal pleasures that sometimes clashed with the sober expectations of kingship. One imagines him reclining in his ornate bedchamber, surrounded by silks and tapestries, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air, while advisors fret over budgets, armies, and alliances. He was, in a quiet way, a man deeply aware of his own comforts and limitations. Illnesses that would have been trivial to others, fevers, fatigue, occasional digestive disturbances, required careful attention and rest. The king maintained a routine that balanced the demands of public ceremony with private indulgence, often drifting through audiences with polite attentiveness while secretly planning the next diversion or quiet moment of leisure. Louis XV's personal life, of course, has attracted much attention, though we should approach it gently. He favored companionship and intimacy with a select few, often to the consternation of advisers and courtiers. Relationships were managed discreetly, but they were also a means of alleviating the isolation inherent in a life lived under constant scrutiny. While some historians focus on the scandalous aspects of these liaisons, we might instead note the quiet human need for connection, however constrained by circumstance and expectation. His health and daily habits reflected the same careful negotiation between duty and personal preference. He rose early, attended ceremonies and councils, but reserved substantial time for rest, reflection, and private indulgence. Versailles, with its endless formality, demanded energy, but Louis understood his limits and arranged his life accordingly. There is a subtle humor in imagining the grand halls filled with anxious courtiers, while the king, ever polite, nods and smiles, reserving his energy for more enjoyable pursuits. Louis XV's reign was long, from 1715 to 1774, marked by periods of stability, cultural flourishing, and occasional political mismanagement. He presided over France during a time of quiet transformation, balancing tradition with subtle reforms. Yet the personal dimension of his reign, his charm, his indulgences, and his occasional retreat from the burdens of kingship, reminds us that power is as much about endurance and management of the self as it is about policy and conquest. And there were challenges, certainly. Wars, financial crises, and courtly intrigue demanded attention. Yet Louis navigated them with a combination of careful delegation, charm, and occasionally gentle avoidance. He was neither reckless nor overtly negligent, but rather someone who understood the delicate balance between exertion and preservation. One can almost imagine him seated in a small private chamber, surrounded by books, letters, or music, gently reminding himself that not all burdens require immediate action. His appearance and habits, much commented upon by contemporaries, reinforce this sense of calculated self-management. Louis was well-groomed, meticulously attired, and attentive to etiquette, yet he also allowed himself small pleasures that softened the formality of court life. Fine wines, elegant meals, and quiet retreats to private gardens or apartments provided relief from ceremonial demands. The king understood that a life of comfort, carefully managed, was a form of political and personal strategy. Louis XV's personal quirks and indulgences also included a fondness for hunting and travel within the confines of the palace. He appreciated beauty and artistry, cultivated gardens, and took a keen interest in architecture and decoration. These pursuits, while seemingly leisurely, also served as subtle exercises in governance, understanding estates, appreciating landscapes, and engaging with artisans and advisors in ways that balanced public duty with personal satisfaction.
And naturally, the court continued to observe, comment, and speculate. Courtiers, ever vigilant, chronicled his moods, habits, and preferences with meticulous care. Yet Louis, with the quiet patience of someone used to observation, managed both the image of authority and the private management of health and energy. There is a subtle irony in this. The king, observed constantly, quietly maneuvered to preserve his well-being while maintaining the outward trappings of majesty. Perhaps most intriguing is the way Louis XV navigated aging. As years passed, he became increasingly aware of personal frailty, yet adapted gracefully. He adjusted routines, delegated tasks, and accepted the quiet limitations imposed by both body and circumstance. In a court obsessed with youth, beauty, and power, he managed the passage of time with understated elegance, avoiding scandal where possible and preserving dignity where necessary. And so, as we reflect on Louis XV, we notice the familiar pattern: great power, delicate management, and human vulnerability intertwined. Elizabeth I, Charles IX, Charles II, Maria Theresa, and now Louis XV, each navigated the tensions between public expectation and private limitation, often with subtle humor, careful calculation, and quiet resilience. Their lives remind us that history is less about unbroken triumph than about the continuous negotiation of human fragility within structures of immense responsibility. Imagine, if you will, the long corridors of Versailles at night. Candles flicker, shadows stretch across gilded walls, and the faint murmur of distant servants punctuates the hush. In a small private room, Louis XV may sit quietly, reviewing papers or listening to music, aware of his responsibilities, yet deliberately preserving moments for himself. These small acts, unnoticed by the wider world, form the quieter texture of monarchy: endurance, self-awareness, and a subtle negotiation with the limits imposed by one's own body and mind. And now, as we prepare to drift further into the labyrinth of European courts, we will move from the opulent yet subtly vulnerable Louis XV to the eccentric, whimsical, and sometimes downright bizarre figures of the 18th and early 19th centuries. There, indulgence, illness, and the curious whims of personality often intersected in ways that are quietly amusing, gently tragic, and perfectly suited for
The eccentric royals, George IV of England and the art of gentle excess, history for sleep. Now, let's cross the English Channel once more and visit a king whose life was defined less by careful calculation or frailty and more by indulgence, whimsy, and the curious contradictions of royal expectation. George IV, known in youth as the Prince of Wales, ascended to the British throne in 1820, bringing with him a blend of opulence, eccentricity, and quietly human vulnerabilities that make him endlessly fascinating, if not entirely admirable. George was born in 1762, the eldest son of George III and Queen Charlotte. From the beginning, he was both privileged and pressured. As heir apparent, he was expected to embody decorum, intelligence, and duty, while also serving as a symbol of continuity and stability. In practice, he often found the ceremonial and political demands exhausting, and he developed personal habits designed both to amuse himself and to cope with the pressures of expectation. Even in childhood, George displayed a tendency toward indulgence and theatricality. He loved fine clothes, elaborate entertainments, and the occasional excess of food and leisure. These traits, while charming to some observers, also hinted at underlying vulnerabilities, emotional, social, and physical. George was often sensitive, reactive, and prone to periods of melancholy or irritability, all of which were subtly exacerbated by the constant observation of the royal household. When he assumed the role of Prince Regent in 1110, due to his father's mental illness, George's personality came fully into view. The Regency period offered him both freedom and responsibility, and he embraced both with characteristic flamboyance. He redecorated palaces, commissioned art, and cultivated an aesthetic of refinement and elegance, all while managing political matters in a manner that was, at times, careless, at times brilliant, and always quietly human. George's personal habits were naturally a matter of public curiosity and private consequence. He was famously indulgent in food, drink, and fashion. He loved elaborate clothing, powdered wigs, and extravagant jewelry. He maintained a series of relationships, some scandalous, some quietly affectionate, all of which reflected both his social position and his personal desires. His health, predictably, suffered as a result. Weight gain, gout, and other elements plagued him, but he approached these challenges with a mixture of humor, denial, and occasional restraint. His relationship with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was notoriously troubled. Arranged for political reasons, the marriage quickly became a source of public scandal and personal discomfort. George avoided her whenever possible, managed the consequences of their estrangement with careful calculation, and allowed his own indulgences to continue largely unchecked. The situation, while awkward and sometimes ridiculous to observers, highlights a recurring theme in royal history: personal vulnerability, social expectation, and the quiet negotiation between duty and desire. George's eccentricity extended beyond diet and fashion. He had a flair for dramatic entrances, elaborate dinners, and theatrical displays of wealth. He redecorated Buckingham Palace, built the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, and maintained a court filled with elaborate ceremonial routines. Yet beneath the grandeur was a man aware of his own physical limitations, sensitive to criticism, and quietly anxious about public perception. His indulgences, in a sense, were both defense mechanisms and personal pleasures, ways of asserting control in a life otherwise dictated by expectation and scrutiny. Despite, or perhaps because of, these quirks, George IV's reign left a lasting imprint on British cultural life. Architecture, fashion, and the arts flourished under his patronage, and the Regency style remains associated with elegance and sophistication. Yet the personal cost was considerable. He suffered from recurring health issues, struggled with emotional instability, and faced constant criticism from the press and Parliament. His life offers a subtle reminder that indulgence and human frailty often coexist with creativity and influence. George's story also provides insight into the quiet absurdities of royal life. While he enjoyed luxuries that most could scarcely imagine, he was perpetually constrained by ceremony, tradition, and expectation. Every meal, every outfit, every public appearance required careful calculation. Even indulgence became a performance, balancing personal desire with the outward appearance of majesty. There is a gentle irony here. The man most devoted to excess also devoted himself meticulously to maintaining the image of refined authority. And yet, in private moments, George displayed a softer, more human side. Letters and accounts suggest moments of tenderness, humor, and vulnerability, reminders that behind the powdered wig and embroidered coat was a man navigating pressures, desires, and physical limitations with quiet, if occasionally flamboyant, skill. He managed pain, discomfort, and expectation with a mixture of resignation and creative coping, a pattern familiar to anyone who has observed history closely. The crown amplifies human tendencies, whether for good, for ill, or for quietly absurd effect. George IV's later years were marked by increasing physical frailty. Obesity, gout, and other chronic conditions limited his mobility and caused frequent discomfort. Courtiers observed him carefully, balancing concern with the need to maintain decorum. Yet he endured. His charm, wit, and intelligence, combined with a keen awareness of presentation, allowed him to maintain authority despite physical decline. It is in many ways a testament to the quiet resilience that underlies even the most flamboyant historical figures. And so, as we drift through George IV's life, we begin to notice a pattern emerging among European royalty. the interplay of human fragility, personal indulgence, and public expectation. Elizabeth I managed her delicate health through calculated solitude. Charles IX endured anxiety and frailty under relentless courtly pressure. Charles II of Spain bore the consequences of inbreeding with quiet endurance. Maria Theresa navigated dynastic obligation with meticulous diligence. Louis XV balanced indulgence with careful preservation, and George IV combined eccentricity, indulgence, and human vulnerability in a manner that was, if not graceful, profoundly human. Imagine for a moment the quiet night at Carlton House or Buckingham Palace. Candles flicker, shadows stretch across gilded halls, and distant footsteps echo softly. In a private chamber, George IV reclines on a sumptuous sofa, perhaps reading, writing letters, or simply resting. The pressures of monarchy linger, but he managed them in small increments. Careful diet, gentle attention to health, moments of reflection, and indulgence as necessary. These quiet acts of management form the hidden rhythm of royal life, often invisible to the public eye, yet essential to survival and sanity. And now, as we prepare to drift further into our exploration of European royalty, we will move from the indulgent eccentricities of George IV to the peculiar, often tragic lives of monarchs whose obsession with lineage, wealth, and ceremony intersected with human vulnerability in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There we will meet figures whose stories are quieter, stranger.
The Fragile Tsars, Paul I of Russia, and the Weight of Suspicion. History for Sleep. Now let's drift eastward to the vast, frost-kissed expanse of Russia, where we encounter Paul I, a Tsar whose life was shaped as much by anxiety and suspicion as by dynastic obligation. Born in 1754 to Catherine the Great and Peter III, Paul spent much of his early life under careful observation, surrounded by the intricate etiquette, courtly intrigue, and occasional coldness of the Russian imperial household. Paul's childhood was quietly unhappy. Catherine, ambitious, pragmatic, and always politically minded, did not display overt maternal warmth. Instead, young Paul was managed carefully, instructed in the arts of courtly protocol, and shielded from excess affection. One can imagine him, small and anxious, moving through the corridors of the Winter Palace, aware that his mother's attention was both selective and conditional, and that the world he was destined to inherit was vast, complex, and unyielding. Physically, Paul was unremarkable but sensitive. He was often described as thin, pale, and nervous, prone to sudden emotional swings. He had difficulty with sleep, was highly aware of his surroundings, and developed a keen sense of danger, or at least the perception of it. His mind, constantly alert to potential threats, compounded the anxieties inherited from both courtly expectation and personal temperament. By the time he assumed the throne in 1796, he had developed habits designed to assert control, maintain vigilance, and manage the quiet tremors of fear that accompanied life at the top. He was meticulous, even obsessive, about military parades, personal routine, and ceremonial observance. Courtiers, soldiers, and advisors quickly learned that deviation from protocol could provoke mild to severe displeasure. Paul's sense of order was, in part, a coping mechanism, a way to manage anxiety by controlling the predictable elements of his environment. It is easy to imagine the Tsar inspecting a line of guards, checking alignment, posture, and precision, while inwardly soothing himself with the satisfaction of discipline achieved. Paranoia, quiet but persistent, was a defining feature of Paul's reign. He suspected plots, imagined conspiracies, and demanded loyalty with a fervor that was often exhausting for those around him. Advisors tread carefully, weighing every word and action, for the Tsar's suspicion could turn subtle criticism into outright censure. And yet, beneath the severity and meticulousness, Paul was also capable of private reflection, gentle humor, and occasional tenderness, a reminder that human complexity persists even under layers of fear and ritual. Health-wise, Paul was relatively robust in terms of constitution, yet prone to stress-related ailments. Insomnia, digestive disturbances, and occasional physical fatigue mirrored the mental and emotional weight he carried. His cautious approach to diet, exercise, and personal routine can be understood not as eccentricity alone, but as a strategy to manage the persistent demands of both body and mind. It is a subtle, almost hypnotic portrait of a man constantly negotiating the fragility of human endurance under the immense weight of empire. Paul's personal life was similarly constrained by circumstance, expectation, and anxiety. He married Maria Fedorovna, a union arranged for dynastic reasons, and bore 10 children. Yet even within the structure of family, he maintained a cautious, controlling presence. Domestic life was carefully orchestrated, as if to preserve not only the dynasty, but also the personal sense of security he so deeply craved. There is a quiet sadness in imagining him supervising the education and conduct of his children with the same vigilance he applied to court affairs, perhaps aware that nothing could entirely guarantee their well-being in a world full of unpredictability. His reign was relatively short, lasting only 4 years, yet filled with the tension that comes from absolute power exercised under extreme anxiety. Policies were designed with caution, ceremonial observance was enforced rigorously, and suspicion underpinned much of daily court life. Paul was not an inherently cruel ruler, though contemporaries often interpreted his exacting nature as harsh. Instead, he was a man attempting to navigate an impossible balance: the personal need for security, the dynastic obligation of authority, and the unpredictable pressures of a vast empire. Tragically, Paul's sensitivity and suspicion made him vulnerable to the very intrigues he feared. In 1801, he was assassinated in his own palace, a quiet, intimate act of betrayal by those closest to him. The scene, while violent in outcome, is almost banal in its inevitability. A ruler consumed by fear, attempting to manage every detail, finally undone by the pressures, personalities, and secret plots he could not fully control. There is a hypnotic, melancholic poetry in this, a reminder that even the most meticulous attention cannot always avert the quiet, inexorable currents of fate. Paul I's story, gentle though it may be in narration, illustrates a recurring motif in royal history: the combination of immense responsibility, human vulnerability, and the persistent anxiety that accompanies absolute power. He reminds us that monarchy, for all its pomp and ceremony, is often a quiet negotiation between personal fragility and public expectation. Survival itself can be an achievement, as can the delicate management of body, mind, and circumstance over the course of a reign. As we drift from Paul I's frost-lined corridors, the dim candlelight reflecting off gilded walls, we notice a subtle pattern emerging among these monarchs. Endurance is as remarkable as triumph, patience as significant as conquest, and personal vulnerability as historically consequential as strategic genius. Elizabeth I, Charles I, Charles II, Maria Theresa, Louis XV, and George I all navigated the delicate interplay of expectation and limitation, public duty and private frailty. Imagine, if you will, Paul sitting quietly in his study, reviewing letters by the glow of a single candle, listening to the muffled sounds of the palace, aware of dangers, real and imagined, and feeling the persistent pressure of the crown resting not just upon his head, but upon his chest, shoulders, and mind. It is a scene that encapsulates the quiet, enduring, and profoundly human aspects of monarchy, those that rarely make it into history textbooks, but remain essential to understanding the lived experience of power. And now, as we prepare to drift further into the evening of our historical exploration, we will turn to another series of figures whose lives blend eccentricity, indulgence, and vulnerability, the later European monarchs of the 19th century, who navigated technological change, personal excess, and the persistent expectations of dynasties in transition. These stories, like the faint flicker of candlelight in a quiet chamber, offer subtle fascination, gentle reflection, and above all, a calm rhythm that eases us.
The indulgent Bourbon kings, Charles X, and the quiet tragedies of Restoration France. Now, let us return to France, a country that, by the early 19th century, had already endured revolutions, restorations, and the tumultuous rise and fall of empires. Here we encounter Charles X, a Bourbon monarch whose life and reign offer a study in the quiet negotiation between personal comfort, dynastic duty, and political expectation. Charles, born in 1757, was the younger brother of Louis XVI and Louis XVIII, and thus intimately acquainted with both the privileges and pitfalls of royal life in a rapidly changing world. Charles's childhood was shaped by careful attention to etiquette, ritual, and the subtle hierarchies of the French court. Even as a boy, he understood that every word, gesture, and posture mattered, not for his own satisfaction, but for the maintenance of the family status and the preservation of dynastic authority. This constant awareness of scrutiny, though perhaps invisible to casual observers, instilled in him a profound sense of caution and, occasionally, timidity. Physically, Charles was neither striking nor robust. He carried the delicate constitution common to many Bourbons, and he was prone to minor illnesses that required careful management. These physical traits, combined with a temperament inclined toward reflection and avoidance of confrontation, created a man who was cautious in speech, deliberate in action, and often quietly anxious under the weight of expectation. It is easy to imagine him moving through the corridors of Versailles, or later the Tuileries, aware of every observer, every whisper, and every potential misstep. Charles married Princess Maria Theresa of Savoy in 1773, a union typical of dynastic politics, arranged for alliance and strategic benefit rather than romantic affection. The marriage produced children, but the pressures of courtly life, combined with Charles's reserved personality, left the domestic sphere subdued and highly managed. He sought to create a stable, orderly environment, though personal warmth was often subdued by anxiety, ritual, and careful attention to appearances. His reign as King of France began in 1824, following the death of Louis XVIII. By this time, Charles was older, cautious, and aware of the fragile political landscape. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored after the chaos of revolution and empire, and the king understood that every decision carried consequences, not just for himself, but for a nation still recovering from upheaval. His approach to governments reflected a delicate balance, a desire to maintain royal authority and tradition, tempered by personal caution and a subtle awareness of the limits of his own influence. Charles's personality and habits were, in a quiet way, both endearing and exasperating to those around him. He enjoyed the comforts of palace life, favored ceremonial observance, and appreciated the arts, literature, and music. Yet he was also rigid, sometimes inflexible, and prone to minor anxieties that amplified ordinary courtly stress. Advisors learned that gentle persuasion, rather than blunt command, often produced better results with the king, a testament to his quiet sensitivity beneath the trappings of authority. Health concerns persisted throughout his life. Charles, like many Bourbon royals, experienced digestive issues, fatigue, and the gradual effects of age. These physical vulnerabilities reinforced his cautious temperament and careful attention to routine. One can imagine him rising slowly in the morning, arranging correspondence and audiences with meticulous care, and ensuring that his energy was expended only where necessary. These daily rituals, though understated, were vital to maintaining both personal stability and the dignity of the crown. Charles's reign was marked by a series of political challenges, some of which required delicate management rather than decisive action. He navigated the restoration of royal authority, social unrest, and the shifting alliances of post-Napoleonic Europe with a quiet diligence that often went unnoticed in the dramatic narratives of history. Yet, for all his care, he could not escape the fundamental tension of a monarchy out of step with the aspirations of a changing society. His caution and preference for ceremonial continuity sometimes conflicted with the practical demands of governments, leading to moments of subtle tension and quiet crisis. And so, Charles's life offers a gentle lesson in the human dimension of monarchy. Authority and fragility are often intertwined. Even a king, surrounded by advisors, soldiers, and courtiers, is subject to the same anxieties, health limitations, and emotional pressures that affect ordinary people. The careful maintenance of routine, the avoidance of unnecessary stress, and the quiet indulgence in comfort all serve as strategies for endurance under the unique pressures of royal life. Imagine Charles in the quiet hours of the evening, seated in a modestly decorated study within the Tuileries Palace. Candlelight flickers across papers and letters, faint music drifts from a distant salon, and the sounds of the palace are muted by the late hour. He reviews reports, considers the delicate balance of power, and perhaps allows himself a small sigh of relief at the absence of immediate crises. It is a scene devoid of grandeur, yet full of quiet human complexity. A king performing the subtle art of endurance rather than the more visible acts of triumph. And so, Charles's life concluded with his abdication in 1830, following growing public unrest. Though he was forced to step down, he did so with dignity, retreating into a quiet life in exile. There is a gentle poignancy in this. A monarch who spent decades navigating expectation, vulnerability, and ceremonial duty, finally freed from the burdens of office, able to spend his remaining years in relative quiet. Even in displacement, the subtle patterns of routine, caution and personal indulgence continued, underscoring the enduring human need for stability amidst the pleasures of history. As we drift away from Charles X's quiet halls, we notice a recurring motif among these later European monarchs: the intersection of vulnerability, indulgence, and ceremonial obligation. Elizabeth I, Charles IX, Charles II, Maria Theresa, Louis XV, George IV, and Paul I each managed the delicate equilibrium of public expectation and private limitation, with varying degrees of success, grace, and eccentricity. And now, as we prepare to move further into the 19th century, we will meet monarchs whose personal quirks, eccentric habits, and occasional indulgences provide a gentle contrast to the rigid structures of dynastic expectation. These stories, quieter and more intimate than battles or political upheavals, reveal the human side of monarchy in all its subtlety and occasional absurdity, perfect for a reflective,
The Whimsical Monarchs, William IV and Queen Victoria's Childhood Shadows, History for Sleep. Now let us drift once more across the English Channel, back to Britain, where the Hanoverian line continued its curious blend of duty, eccentricity, and quietly human vulnerability. Here we meet William IV, known in youth as the Duke of Clarence, and glimpse the early, shadowed life of Queen Victoria, whose childhood would quietly shape one of the longest reigns in history. William was born in 1765, the third son of George III and Queen Charlotte. As a younger son, he was never expected to inherit the throne, which afforded him a certain freedom from the suffocating scrutiny reserved for heirs. Yet this freedom came with its own peculiar pressures. He was constantly aware of expectations, social norms, and the obligations of royalty, even when they seemed less urgent than for his elder brothers. From an early age, William displayed traits that would define much of his life: a fondness for adventure, a taste for practical jokes, and a preference for a simpler, more straightforward approach to life than the meticulous formality of courtly routine. He was charming, lively, and occasionally exasperating to those around him, with a manner that combined both youthful impulsivity and an underlying sense of responsibility. His physical health was generally robust, though he shared with many of his family a sensitivity to illness, particularly during periods of stress or travel. Even so, he grew into a man known for his stamina and energy, a contrast to some of the more fragile figures we've encountered. Yet energy alone did not temper the quiet anxieties of royal life. William was acutely aware of public perception, familial expectation, and the delicate balance between indulgence and decorum. William's early naval career offered both distraction and education. He spent years at sea, acquiring practical knowledge, developing leadership skills, and indulging in the tastes and rhythms of a life slightly removed from courtly scrutiny. These experiences shaped his character, instilling resilience and a preference for direct action, while also providing subtle lessons in endurance, discretion, and the management of personal comfort in the face of expectation. And yet William's path to the throne was indirect. He only became king in 1830, following the death of his elder brothers, George IV and Frederick, Duke of York. By this time, he was older, experienced, and conscious of the limitations and responsibilities that the crown imposed.
His reign, though relatively short, was marked by pragmatism, occasional whimsy, and the quiet negotiation of personal desire against the weight of tradition. Parallel to William's life, we consider the young Victoria, born in 1819, who would one day inherit the throne. Her childhood was carefully managed by the Kensington system, an elaborate framework devised by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her advisor, Sir John Conroy. This system was designed to instill discipline, obedience, and awareness of courtly expectation. But it also imposed strict limitations on freedom, social interaction, and personal development. Victoria grew up largely isolated, under constant supervision, and encouraged to focus on education, etiquette, and preparation for eventual monarchy. Her physical health was generally good, though she suffered occasional illnesses typical of the era. More significantly, her emotional and social development was constrained by the rigid structures imposed upon her, creating a quiet tension between natural curiosity, youthful energy, and the weight of expectation. In both William and Victoria, we see echoes of familiar royal patterns: personal vulnerability, careful attention to routine, and the subtle interplay between indulgence, discipline, and the management of appearance. William's early freedom and naval adventures contrast with Victoria's regimented upbringing, yet both experiences demonstrate how childhood circumstances quietly shape the capacities, anxieties, and coping strategies of future monarchs. William, as king, indulged a practical, down-to-earth approach. He appreciated direct engagement with advisors, the management of naval and military matters, and occasional displays of humor or whimsy. He understood that personal energy, health, and attention were finite resources, and he managed them carefully, balancing duty with the quiet pursuit of satisfaction. Victoria, meanwhile, absorbed the lessons of constraint, discipline, and meticulous preparation, which would later manifest in her extraordinary capacity for governance, ceremonial observance, and endurance. There is a gentle, hypnotic quality to imagining their lives. William at sea, navigating storms, supervising sailors, and learning the rhythms of practical command. Victoria, in her nursery and study, guided step by step through the minutiae of etiquette, education, and controlled interaction. Both demonstrate the subtle ways in which personal temperament, family expectation, and historical circumstance intertwine to shape lives that, while highly public, are quietly governed by the same human needs for comfort, routine, and coping with anxiety. William's later life also illustrates the peculiar balance between indulgence and responsibility. He enjoyed simple pleasures, hunting, horse riding, and social gatherings, while maintaining careful oversight of political matters and ceremonial duties. There is an understated charm in this combination: a man aware of his privileges, conscious of his responsibilities, and attentive to both, without the relentless obsession that marks some of his contemporaries. Victoria's early experience, by contrast, instilled caution, reflection, and self-control. Even in isolation, she developed a keen awareness of her own limitations, the necessity of observation, and the importance of deliberate, careful action. These lessons, though imposed, contributed to the resilience, patience, and endurance that would define her long and historically significant reign. As we drift from the corridors of early 19th century England, we notice once again the recurring motif in royal life: the interplay of human vulnerability, personal indulgence, and the weight of dynastic expectation. Elizabeth I, Charles IX, Charles II, Maria Theresa, Louis XV, George IV, Paul I, Charles X, William IV, and now Victoria in childhood, all navigated these tensions in ways both quiet and compelling. Their lives remind us that history is often shaped not by dramatic conquest, but by the subtle rhythms of daily survival, the management of health and habit, and the negotiation of expectation against personal temperament. Imagine, for a final moment in this part, young Victoria seated by a small window in Kensington Palace, candlelight flickering, books and letters neatly arranged before her, while distant footsteps echo softly in the hall. Or William, years earlier, standing on the deck of a ship, wind in his hair, surveying the horizon with quiet confidence and awareness of responsibility. These images, gentle and reflective, encapsulate the human dimension of royalty, endurance, discretion, and the subtle management of fragility amidst grandeur. And now, as we prepare to drift further into our exploration of monarchy, we will turn to the 19th century European courts where personal eccentricities, indulgences, and vulnerabilities continue to shape history quietly, often in ways more subtle than battles or political upheavals, yet no less.
The peculiar Kaisers, Wilhelm I, Frederick III, and the weight of German ambition in History for Sleep. Now let us drift eastward once more to the German states of the 19th century, a region of rising ambition, elaborate ceremony, and quietly human fragility beneath the veneer of imperial authority. Here we encounter Wilhelm I, later Emperor of Germany, and his son, Frederick III, whose lives reveal the subtle, often overlooked human costs of dynastic expectation. Wilhelm was born in 1797, the second son of the Duke of Brunswick and Princess Louise of Prussia. From the beginning, he was steeped in military culture, hierarchical expectation, and the disciplined routines of Prussian aristocracy. He grew up in an environment that emphasized duty, endurance, and the careful management of personal habit, lessons that would serve him throughout his long life. Physically, Wilhelm was robust, yet not immune to the anxieties and pressures that accompany responsibility. He displayed a methodical temperament, favoring routine, careful attention to military and administrative matters, and a restrained approach to indulgence. Unlike some of the more flamboyant monarchs we've encountered, Wilhelm's life was governed by precision, predictability, and the quiet satisfaction of order maintained. When Wilhelm became King of Prussia in 1861, and later German Emperor in 1871, he carried with him a lifetime of disciplined preparation. Yet even as he navigated the challenges of unification, diplomacy, and ceremonial obligation, he remained aware of his own vulnerabilities, the frailty of human health, the limits of personal influence, and the quiet anxieties that accompany concentrated power. He was disciplined, patient, and at times quietly humorous, understanding the subtle balance between authority and the human need for reflection and rest. Wilhelm's son, Frederick III, provides a fascinating counterpoint. Born in 1831, Frederick inherited both the meticulous training of Prussian militarism and the genetic legacy of his forebears. He grew into a man of intelligence, charm, and an unusually sensitive temperament for someone raised in a culture of rigid hierarchy. He was thoughtful,
reflective, and occasionally hesitant, qualities that made him a beloved figure in private but complicated his public role. Frederick's life illustrates the quiet tragedy that often accompanies dynastic expectation. He suffered from illness for much of his adult life, including the throat cancer that would ultimately claim him shortly after ascending the throne in 1888. Despite his brilliance and popularity, his health limited his ability to govern fully, leaving the empire to be managed largely by others. It is a reminder that even the most capable and prepared individuals remain subject to the fragility of the human body, a theme that echoes across centuries of royal experience. Both Wilhelm and Frederick exemplify the subtle human tensions inherent in monarchy. Wilhelm's disciplined routine, careful attention to military and administrative affairs, and pragmatic indulgences contrast with Frederick's sensitivity, intellectual curiosity, and bodily vulnerability. Yet in both, we observe the same quiet patterns that have emerged throughout our historical exploration. Careful management of habit, attention to public perception, and negotiation of personal limitations in the service of dynastic expectation. Imagine Wilhelm in the quiet of a Prussian palace, seated with maps and dispatches, the faint echo of distant footsteps in the corridor, and a sense of calm purpose settling over him. Or Frederick, confined by illness, yet absorbed in reading, reflection, and correspondence, aware of the responsibilities he will inherit, but constrained by the delicate limitations of his body. These scenes, subtle and unremarkable to the casual observer, reveal the human rhythm behind the ceremonial and historical facade: endurance, discretion, and quiet management of vulnerability. Wilhelm's longevity and Frederick's brief, poignant reign highlight another recurring theme: the unpredictable intersection of human fragility and historical expectation. Dynastic ambition, public responsibility, and ceremonial obligation often collide with the simple realities of health, temperament, and circumstance. The careful orchestration of appearance, habit, and attention, common to Elizabeth I, Maria Theresa, Louis XV, George IV, Paul I, Charles X, William IV, and Victoria, remains central to understanding the lived experience of monarchs across centuries. In both father and son, we see how personal temperament shapes public perception. Wilhelm's steadiness and discipline reinforced his authority and the sense of stability that German unification demanded. Frederick's charm, intelligence, and sensitivity, combined with his ill health, left a quieter impression, one of potential unfulfilled, a reign cut short not by politics, but by the inexorable limitations of the human body. There is in this contrast a gentle melancholy and a subtle lesson that history is as much about endurance, preparation, and personal management as it is about triumph, conquest, or legacy. As we drift from the stately halls of Berlin and Potsdam, we notice the continuing pattern across European royalty. Behind ceremony, power, and prestige lies a constant negotiation with human limitation. These monarchs, though celebrated for military achievements, administrative skill, or dynastic success, spent countless hours managing fatigue, anxiety, illness, and the subtle pressures of expectation. Their personal lives, quiet, constrained, occasionally indulgent, offer a mirror into the hidden rhythms of history, those that are often invisible but profoundly influential. Imagine the quiet evening in Wilhelm's study, the flicker of a lamp across maps and letters, the faint murmur of staff in the distance, and a monarch reflecting on decisions, alliances, and responsibilities. Now picture Frederick, weakened by illness, reading quietly in his chamber, aware of his limited time, yet determined to fulfill obligations as best he can. These images, gentle and reflective, encapsulate the human dimension of monarchy, careful endurance, awareness of limitation, and subtle negotiation with circumstance. And now, as we prepare to drift further into the late 19th century, we will turn to European courts where eccentricity, indulgence, and fragile health intertwine in fascinating ways. Monarchs whose personal habits, whims, and vulnerabilities shaped both their reigns and their historical legacies.
The fragile and flamboyant Ludwig II of Bavaria and the gentle weight of dreams. Now let us drift south to the forested hills and sparkling lakes of Bavaria, where we meet Ludwig II, a monarch whose life was defined less by political ambition than by dreams, artistic obsession, and personal fragility. Born in 1845, Ludwig was the eldest son of Maximilian II of Bavaria and Princess Marie of Prussia, and from the start he carried the weight of dynastic expectation combined with an intensely personal, imaginative inner world. Ludwig's childhood was marked by careful supervision, a strong sense of duty, and a pronounced sensitivity to both the joys and anxieties of life at court. He was introverted, delicate in health, and emotionally perceptive, traits that would define his reign and set him apart from the more pragmatic monarchs we have met. From a young age, Ludwig found solace in music, literature, and architecture, cultivating a dreamlike inner life that both enriched and complicated his daily existence. Physically, Ludwig was fragile. He suffered from frequent illnesses, respiratory problems, and the delicate constitution typical of many European royals. These vulnerabilities informed his temperament. He was cautious in public, deliberate in action, and often retreated from the pressures of court life into private contemplation or creative projects. His health shaped not only his daily routine, but also the way he perceived duty, responsibility, and personal fulfillment. One of the most striking aspects of Ludwig's character was his devotion to the arts, particularly music and architecture. He idolized Richard Wagner, whose operas became central to Ludwig's personal and cultural life, and he commissioned elaborate castles and palaces that reflected his vision of beauty, fantasy, and escape. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, names now synonymous with whimsy and grandeur, were manifestations of his inner life, spaces designed for imagination, reflection, and retreat from the relentless scrutiny of monarchy. Ludwig's relationship with politics was, in contrast, cautious and often reluctant. He was not uninterested in government, but his delicate health, introverted nature, and preference for aesthetic contemplation made administrative duties taxing. Ministers and advisors, aware of his sensitivity, managed many practical matters, leaving Ludwig free to pursue personal projects. There is a quiet irony here. The king, invested in the fantastical and the artistic, was obliged to carry the weight of an entire kingdom, a balance he managed with gentle eccentricity rather than overt authority. His personal habits reflected the same combination of fragility and indulgence. Ludwig adhered to careful routines to preserve his health, scheduling meals, exercise, and rest with meticulous attention. He enjoyed solitude,
the company of artists, and the pleasures of architectural and musical creation. Yet he also cultivated a public persona of enigmatic eccentricity, leaving observers both intrigued and bewildered by his unconventional behavior. Romantic relationships, too, were a source of subtle tension and intrigue. Ludwig's orientation, private and discreet, meant that his affections were rarely visible in public. His longing for intimacy and companionship existed in a shadowed, carefully managed space, further complicated by the expectations of dynastic marriage and political alliance. It is possible to imagine the quiet sadness of a monarch constrained by duty, health, and societal expectation, yet seeking beauty, connection, and transcendence wherever possible. Ludwig's reign, beginning in 1864, was marked by this delicate tension between imagination and obligation, health and duty, solitude and scrutiny. He governed Bavaria with care, relying on advisors for practical administration, while dedicating himself to the creation of artistic and architectural marvels. There is a gentle poetry in this approach, a monarch whose legacy is measured not only in treaties or military achievements, but in beauty, reflection, and the quietly eccentric pursuit of personal fulfillment. Health remained a persistent concern throughout Ludwig's life. Respiratory problems, fatigue, and stress often required him to withdraw from public engagements. These vulnerabilities shaped his interactions with court, ministers, and the public. Ludwig's retreat into fantasy, architecture, and music was both a coping mechanism and a deliberate expression of personal identity, a way to navigate the pressures of monarchy while preserving the fragile equilibrium of body, mind, and spirit. The circumstances of Ludwig's death in 1886, sudden and mysterious, have been much discussed. Whether accidental or otherwise, it reflects the quiet vulnerability that had characterized his life, a fragile constitution, an introspective temperament, and the relentless pressures of expectation all converged in a manner both poignant and enigmatic. It is, in a subdued way, the final illustration of the recurring theme. Human fragility persists even beneath the grandeur of monarchy, shaping both life and historical memory. As we drift from Ludwig II's palaces, imagining the quiet corridors of Neuschwanstein or the tranquil gardens of Linderhof, we notice again the interplay of indulgence, fragility, and careful routine. Elizabeth I, Louis XV, George IV, Paul I, Charles I, William I, young Victoria, Wilhelm I, Frederick III, and now Ludwig II, all reveal the subtler rhythms of royal life. Power, appearance, and ceremony may capture public attention, yet the quiet management of health, habit, and personal inclination defines the lived experience of these monarchs in ways that are both gentle and compelling. Imagine Ludwig standing alone on a balcony overlooking misty Bavarian hills, the soft strains of Wagnerian music floating from a nearby hall, candlelight flickering through palace windows. He is aware of his obligations, yet allows himself a private indulgence in beauty, imagination, and quiet reflection. These moments, small and intimate, form the hidden heartbeat of monarchy, endurance, personal indulgence, and the subtle negotiation of human limitation amidst grandeur. And now, as we prepare to drift further into the twilight of 19th century European royalty, we will explore the quietly eccentric, indulgent, and often vulnerable monarchs of the later Victorian and Edwardian periods, figures whose personal habits and peculiarities subtly shaped both domestic life and historical perception in ways that are hypnotic, reflective.
The Edwardian royals, George V, Alexandra, and the quiet strains of duty. History for sleep. Now let us linger once more in Britain, moving forward to the Edwardian era, a time of subtle societal change, ceremonial opulence, and the quiet burdens of monarchy. Here we meet George V, born in 1865, and his consort, Queen Alexandra, whose lives reveal the delicate interplay of duty, personal vulnerability, and quiet endurance behind the public facade. George, born the second son of Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark, spent much of his early life navigating both expectation and restraint. As a younger son, he was not immediately destined for the throne, yet his upbringing was steeped in strict routine, careful observation, and disciplined education. These habits shaped his temperament, reserved, meticulous, and deeply aware of both the opportunities and constraints of royal life. Physically, George was sturdy and reasonably robust, though not immune to the anxieties, illnesses, and subtle vulnerabilities of his family. He shared a cautious approach to health, favoring routine, measured indulgence, and a careful balance of activity and rest. It is easy to imagine him in his youth, meticulously attending lessons, military drills, and formal duties, while quietly observing the complex social interplay around him. Queen Alexandra, born Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1844, possessed both charm and refinement. Her early life, shaped by strict courtly expectations, fostered grace, discipline, and acute awareness of appearance and behavior. Alexandra's health and composure were generally good, yet she too experienced the quiet anxieties of royalty, the need to maintain dignity, manage social expectations, and negotiate the sometimes delicate emotional lives of a large family. Their marriage in 1893 combined dynastic purpose with personal affection, a union typical of the period, politically advantageous, yet supported by genuine regard and mutual respect. Both George and Alexandra were conscientious, thoughtful, and aware of the responsibilities that lay ahead. Their early married life was defined by careful management of public appearances, domestic routine, and the subtle cultivation of alliances, both familial and social. George's accession to the throne in 1910 marked the beginning of a reign shaped by ceremonial duty, wartime pressures, and personal vulnerability. Physically, he managed chronic discomfort with disciplined attention to health, diet, and rest. Mentally, he balanced the weight of expectations, political responsibility, and the subtle anxieties inherited from a long line of cautious, meticulous monarchs. In quiet moments, George would have reflected on the paradox of monarchy: immense public visibility, paired with intimate personal constraint. Queen Alexandra remained a steady presence, offering support, charm, and refinement. She managed household routines, social expectation, and charitable work with disciplined care, all while attending to the well-being of her family. Her attentiveness extended not only to public duties, but to the subtle health, emotional balance, and personal comfort of those around her, illustrating the often overlooked human labor underlying ceremonial life. The couple's children, raised under careful supervision, experienced both the privileges and constraints of royal upbringing. Routine,
education, and exposure to public expectation were balanced with measures designed to preserve health, character, and discretion. George and Alexandra, aware of the vulnerabilities inherent in monarchy, sought to instill resilience while maintaining the dignity and decorum expected of the family. Even amidst ceremony, wartime responsibility, and public expectation, George and Alexandra found small indulgences. Walks in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, reading quietly in the evening, and the occasional musical or artistic engagement provided moments of respite from the persistent pressures of duty. These small routines, carefully maintained, reveal a pattern we have seen across centuries of royalty: the subtle balance of personal care, indulgence, and attention to public expectation. The Edwardian era and later the tumultuous years of World War I exposed the couple to heightened public scrutiny, political pressure, and the emotional strains of global conflict. George's meticulous attention to detail, disciplined approach to health, and quiet sense of duty allowed him to navigate these challenges with composure, while Alexandra's steadiness provided an essential complement. Together, they embodied the subtle interplay of endurance, decorum, and private management that underlies much of royal history. Imagine for a moment the quiet evenings at Windsor Castle, candlelight flickering across polished wood, soft echoes of distant footsteps, and George and Alexandra quietly reviewing correspondence, attending to family matters, or simply reflecting on the day. These moments, intimate and largely invisible to the public, form the hidden rhythm of monarchy: small acts of endurance, disciplined attention to routine, and the subtle negotiation of human vulnerability beneath ceremonial grandeur. George V and Alexandra's story highlights the enduring theme of this series, that monarchy, far from being defined solely by conquest, ceremony, or spectacle, is also about subtle, quiet management of self, family, and circumstance. Even in the face of social change, political upheaval, and personal vulnerability, the careful attention to habit, routine, and personal endurance shapes the lived experience of rulers, leaving a quieter but no less profound historical imprint. And so, as we drift from the Edwardian courts, observing the subtle patterns of duty, indulgence, and vulnerability, we are reminded once more of the human dimension of royalty. Across centuries, from Elizabeth I to Ludwig II, from George IV to George V, monarchs have negotiated the delicate interplay of expectation and limitation, indulgence and discipline, public visibility and private fragility. These quiet, reflective rhythms of life, often hidden behind ceremony and spectacle, form the heartbeat of history in ways both gentle and hypnotic, perfect for
The fragile last emperors, Nicholas II of Russia and Wilhelm II of Germany. Now, let us drift east and west once more, to the fading grandeur of Imperial Russia and the rising authority of Germany, where we meet Nicholas II of Russia and Wilhelm II of Germany. Their lives, overlapping in time, yet separated by circumstance and temperament, reveal the quiet vulnerabilities, personal anxieties, and subtle eccentricities of late European monarchy. Nicholas II, born in 1868, was the eldest son of Alexander III and Maria Feodorovna. He grew up under strict supervision, immersed in ritual, etiquette, and the pervasive sense of duty that defined the Romanov household. Childhood, while protected and privileged, was also constricted. Play and spontaneity were secondary to education, discipline, and preparation for the throne.
Young Nicholas was taught to navigate both ceremonial expectation and familial expectation, lessons that would shape his temperament throughout his reign. Physically, Nicholas was of slight build, with fragile health and frequent susceptibility to illness. These vulnerabilities influenced not only his personal habits, but his approach to governance. Caution, careful routine, and attention to detail became central to his character, balancing innate shyness and sensitivity with the immense pressures of absolute power. Nicholas's marriage to Alexandra of Hesse in 1894 added another layer of personal and dynastic complexity. Alexandra, delicate and deeply pious, shared Nicholas's sensitivity, yet her own frailty and temperament often intensified the challenges of courtly life. Their relationship, marked by affection, but also constrained by health concerns and family obligations, produced 4 daughters and 1 son, each child bearing the weight of dynastic expectation in subtle and pervasive ways. The Romanov court, vast and ceremonial, imposed constant pressures. Nicholas's quiet anxiety, attention to ritual, and personal meticulousness defined daily life. He managed audiences, correspondence, and administrative duties with diligence, yet his sensitivity often made decisive action slow and personal hesitation a frequent feature. The quiet tension between private frailty and public responsibility became a defining characteristic of his reign. To the west, Wilhelm II of Germany, born in 1859, presents a contrasting temperament. Energetic, bold, and often impulsive, Wilhelm was physically robust and socially assertive, yet he too carried vulnerabilities. A pronounced lameness in childhood and insecurities regarding personal perception shaped his personality. His upbringing, while privileged, emphasized martial valor, dynastic duty, and the cultivation of public image, preparing him for a role that demanded both visibility and decisive action. Wilhelm's reign, beginning in 1888, displayed a dynamic energy often tempered by underlying insecurities. Publicly, he projected strength, confidence, and imperial authority. Privately, he contended with self-doubt, the management of personal relationships, and the subtle anxieties inherited from his upbringing. The interplay of robust physicality with inward sensitivity created a monarch whose actions were both bold and, at times, self-limiting. Both Nicholas and Wilhelm illustrate the subtle ways in which personal health, temperament, and upbringing influence the exercise of power. Nicholas's cautious sensitivity contrasts with Wilhelm's assertive energy, yet both were products of dynastic expectation, societal constraint, and the persistent human limitations that underlie ceremonial grandeur. Their daily routines, reviewing correspondence, attending audiences, and managing private and familial concerns were exercises in quiet endurance as much as political governance. The final years of their reigns reveal the fragile balance between human vulnerability and historical consequence. Nicholas, confronted with revolution, social upheaval, and the strains of World War I, struggled to maintain authority and stability, his frailties amplified by circumstance. Wilhelm, facing a rapidly changing Europe, navigated diplomatic tension, military ambition, and personal expectation, often with impulsive decisions that reflected both confidence and insecurity. Imagine for a moment Nicholas seated in the Winter Palace, candlelight flickering across reports, the muffled sounds of St. Petersburg's night outside, and a quiet anxiety underscoring every decision. Or Wilhelm in Berlin, pacing along ornate corridors, reflecting on telegrams, alliances, and the subtle pressures of perception, and legacy. These intimate, largely invisible moments form the hidden rhythm of monarchy: personal endurance, careful management of vulnerability, and negotiation of expectation beneath the grandeur of history. Their lives remind us of a recurring theme throughout our exploration. Monarchy is not only about ceremony, military might, or political spectacle. It is about subtle negotiation with human limitation, the careful management of health and habit, and the persistent interplay of personal temperament with dynastic expectation. Across centuries, from Elizabeth I to Ludwig II, from George V to Nicholas II and Wilhelm II, these quiet rhythms shape both the lived experience of rulers and the way history remembers them. And so, as we drift from the twilight of the Romanovs and the German Kaisers, we notice a final, gently hypnotic pattern. The great dramas of history often unfold quietly within chambers, corridors, and private studies, influenced by small habits, personal anxieties, and subtle indulgences. The human heartbeat beneath ceremonial grandeur persists, shaping both decisions and memory, and offering a calm, reflective rhythm. The quiet endings, the last monarchs before modernity. History for sleep. Now let us drift to the early 20th century, a period when monarchy, while still ceremonially grand, increasingly met the subtle pressures of modernity, political change, and social expectation. Here we encounter Alfonso XIII of Spain, Umberto II of Italy, and a few other monarchs whose lives quietly reflect the human dimension of royal decline, fragility, eccentricity, and the delicate negotiation of authority amidst shifting times. Alfonso XIII, born in 1886, became king from birth, as his father had died before he was born. Imagine, if you will, a child immediately encumbered with dynastic expectation, public visibility, and ceremonial attention, all before learning to walk or speak. His early life, though protected and privileged, was constrained. Education, etiquette, and a constant awareness of public perception shaped both temperament and routine. Physically, Alfonso was reasonably healthy in childhood, though like many monarchs, he contended with the anxieties of early scrutiny. His upbringing emphasized ceremony and duty, but also offered limited freedom. As he matured, Alfonso developed a penchant for indulgence, gambling, lavish entertainment, and social engagement. These habits, while personally gratifying, often collided with public expectation and political responsibility, highlighting the subtle tension between desire and duty that marks many royal lives. Alfonso's reign, beginning in 1902, coincided with a period of political instability in Spain, social unrest, military conflict, and the slow erosion of monarchical authority. He was keenly aware of his precarious position, yet his personal habits and inclinations sometimes undermined the gravitas expected of a monarch. It is gentle irony, in a quiet sense, to imagine a king attending to formal ceremonies in the morning, only to indulge in gambling or social diversions in the evening. A private rhythm of pleasure and responsibility quietly shaping history. Umberto II of Italy, born in 1904, offers a different reflection on the late monarchy. He reigned for a mere month in 1946, the last king of Italy. Yet his life had been carefully structured for decades. Childhood and youth were marked by strict discipline, attention to public appearance, and meticulous preparation for ceremonial duties. Physical and mental endurance were constantly exercised. Military training, language study, and social etiquette formed the undercurrent of his early life. Umberto's personal habits were disciplined, though he enjoyed small indulgences, private reading, and occasional reflection. His temperament, cautious and measured, contrasted with the dramatic brevity of his reign. In these brief weeks as king, the accumulated discipline of decades quietly underpinned his conduct, even as the monarchy itself faced irrevocable decline. One can almost hear the quiet sigh of a man performing ceremonial duty while acutely aware that the era of his class and lifestyle was drawing to a close. Other monarchs of the period, from the minor German princes to Balkan rulers, shared similar patterns: careful cultivation of health, meticulous attention to routine, and the management of personal eccentricities within the bounds of ceremonial expectation. These figures, though less celebrated in history books, demonstrate the recurring rhythm we have traced through centuries. Monarchs navigating vulnerability, indulgence, and duty, often quietly, often invisibly, yet profoundly influencing the texture of their reigns. Even as political structures shifted and republics arose, the personal lives of these monarchs remained curiously anchored in the habits, anxieties, and routines of centuries past. Daily life, meals, correspondence, exercise, reflection, and the cultivation of discrete pleasures remained the quiet framework upon which public performance rested. Health concerns, temperamental quirks, and subtle eccentricities continued to shape decisions and interactions, reminding us that history is as much about human limitation as it is about policy or spectacle. Imagine Alfonso XIII in the evening of a formal gala, the chandeliers glittering above, quietly reflecting on reports, correspondence, and the social obligations of monarchy, while perhaps planning a private indulgence. Picture Umberto II, shortly after abdication, retreating to a quiet study, reading letters from family and allies, navigating private concerns in a world that had changed irrevocably around him. These intimate, largely invisible moments form the subtle heartbeat of history: endurance, reflection, and the negotiation of human limitation beneath ceremonial grandeur. Through Alfonso XIII, Umberto II, and their contemporaries, we witness the final echoes of traditional European monarchy, a complex interplay of personal vulnerability, ritualized authority, and the persistent negotiation between indulgence and duty. These quiet endings, often overshadowed by political upheaval and historical narrative, are in many ways the most human, offering reflective insights into the ordinary pressures and eccentricities of extraordinary lives. As we drift from the final monarchs of Europe, we notice a gentle pattern that has guided our journey. From Elizabeth I's loneliness to Ludwig II's dreamlike indulgences, from George V's careful endurance to Nicholas II's anxious stewardship, monarchs have been defined as much by personal fragility, routine, and quiet eccentricity as they are by their power or historical achievements. The heartbeat of history is often subtle, reflective, and private, a rhythm both hypnotic and soothing, perfect for contemplation on a calm evening. And now, as we prepare to draw this long journey toward a gentle close, we will explore the overarching patterns, recurring eccentricities, and quiet tragedies that unify centuries of European royalty. a final reflection on the human dimension beneath the pomp.
Now, as we settle into the quietest corridors of memory and history, let us reflect on the gentle rhythms that have shaped the lives of monarchs across Europe for centuries. From Elizabeth I's careful loneliness to Ludwig II's dreamlike indulgence, from George V's disciplined endurance to Nicholas II's anxious vigilance, we notice recurring patterns: human fragility, private eccentricity, and the subtle negotiation of expectation. Royal life, despite its outward grandeur, is built upon routine. Meals are measured, correspondence is carefully managed, and the days are meticulously structured. Even the most indulgent monarchs, Louis XV with his secretive pleasures, George IV with his extravagant whims, or Alfonso XIII with his social diversions, relied on quiet routines to maintain balance. There is a hypnotic rhythm here, almost meditative, a world in which every habit, every minute of energy, and every indulgence is quietly weighed against the responsibilities of power. Fragility is another recurrent motif. Many monarchs, from Paul I of Russia to Frederick III of Germany, suffered from delicate health. These vulnerabilities shaped personality, temperament, and decision-making, reminding us that beneath the ceremonial robes, crowns, and scepters were ordinary human bodies, subject to fatigue, illness, and the subtle anxieties of survival. The weight of empire, kingdom, or court rested upon shoulders that were, in many cases, surprisingly human. Eccentricity, often understated and private, is equally characteristic. Ludwig II's castles, George IV's wardrobe extravagances, and Wilhelm II's occasional impulsive declarations reveal a pattern of private indulgence and subtle rebellion against the constraints of royal expectation. These eccentricities, though sometimes whimsical, often served practical functions: a retreat from stress, a preservation of health, or a careful assertion of individuality within a rigidly prescribed world. Marriage and family life also reveal quiet complexities. Many unions, Elizabeth I's intentional solitude, Maria Theresa's meticulously managed household, Nicholas II's delicate partnership with Alexandra, illustrate the tension between public duty and private inclination. Children were trained, observed, and often isolated, perpetuating patterns of careful routine and subtle anxiety. In many ways, the domestic sphere was both a sanctuary and a stage, a space where personal fragility and dynastic expectation intersected in intimate ways. Even politics and public responsibility are shaped by these private rhythms. Wilhelm I's disciplined deliberation, George V's careful management of wartime expectation, and Alfonso XIII's navigation of social unrest demonstrate how personal temperament influences historical outcome. Authority is not exercised in a vacuum. It flows from the daily management of body, habit, and attention, filtered through the subtle eccentricities and limitations of human life. Let us imagine, finally, the quiet evenings of these monarchs across centuries. Elizabeth I, solitary in her chambers, reflecting on counsel, correspondence, and personal limitation. Ludwig II, gazing across misty Bavarian hills, lost in music and architectural fantasy. Nicholas II, reviewing reports by lamplight in the Winter Palace, mindful of his frailty and responsibility. These moments, intimate and largely invisible, formed the true pulse of monarchy: endurance, reflection, and the gentle negotiation of human vulnerability beneath ceremony. As we drift toward the end of our journey, we notice that this story is not about spectacle, conquest, or the ostentation of crowns, but about subtle, recurring rhythms, the balance of indulgence and duty, the management of fragile health, the quiet eccentricities that mark each ruler. It is hypnotic, reflective, and profoundly human, a lullaby of history that allows us to consider the private lives behind public authority. And so, as you sink further into comfort and calm, let your mind float gently through the corridors of time. Picture the candlelit rooms, quiet gardens, and misty landscapes of European royalty. Hear the soft echo of footsteps on palace floors, the faint rustle of papers, the gentle strain of music in a distant hall. Notice the subtle heartbeat of history, the fragile, indulgent, and eccentric pulse of human life beneath the crowns. A soothing reminder that even history has its quiet moments of reflection. Let yourself drift now, gently through centuries of candlelit rooms, quiet gardens, and ceremonial halls. Let the hypnotic rhythm of monarchs' lives, their fragility, indulgence, and private eccentricities soothe your mind. And as sleep approaches, remember that beneath every crown, every scepter, and every gilded hall, there is a human heartbeat, steady and reflective, guiding history in its subtle, hypnotic